The empath who finally stops giving doesn't look like someone who's healing. They look like someone who's broken. Their family says something happened to them. Their friends say they've changed and not for the better. The people who used to rely on them for emotional labor around the clock feel abandoned, betrayed, confused. Because the empath who once gave everything, their time, their energy, their peace, their entire sense of self, has suddenly stopped. And the world around them doesn't see a person reclaiming their life. They see someone becoming selfish. Carl Jung studied this transformation for decades, and what he found will unsettle you. Because he didn't defend empaths against the accusation of selfishness. He didn't comfort them by saying they weren't being selfish. He said something far more radical. He said empaths must become selfish to survive. That the version of selflessness they'd been practicing wasn't virtue, it was self-annihilation. And that the thing everyone around them called selfishness was actually the first sign of genuine psychological health. Jung observed something in his most empathic patients that disturbed him deeply. These weren't people struggling with minor boundary issues. These were people hemorrhaging themselves into everyone around them, pouring their life force into others until there was nothing left. And they did this believing it was love, believing it was who they were, believing that their worth as human beings depended entirely on how much of themselves they were willing to sacrifice. Jung recognized that this wasn't empathy at all. It was a wound dressed up as a gift, and he knew that unless these people learned to do the thing their entire identity told them was wrong, to put themselves first, that wound would eventually kill them. Not metaphorically. Their bodies would break down, their minds would fracture, their spirits would collapse under the weight of carrying everyone else's existence while neglecting their own. Today I'm going to show you why Jung believed empaths had to embrace what the world calls selfishness. What's actually happening psychologically when an empath can't stop giving? The specific mechanism that makes self-sacrifice feel like love when it's actually destruction. And what happens when an empath finally reclaims the parts of themselves they were taught to give away? If you've been told your whole life that your value lies in what you do for others, Jung would tell you that belief is the most dangerous thing living inside you, and dismantling it might be the only thing that saves your life. To understand why empaths must become selfish, you first need to understand what Jung discovered about where their compulsive giving actually comes from. Because it doesn't come from a generous heart. It doesn't come from spiritual evolution. It doesn't come from being a naturally loving person. It comes from a survival pattern installed so early in childhood that the empath can't distinguish it from who they are. Jung documented a specific developmental trajectory in nearly every empath he treated. As children, these individuals learned that love was conditional. Not through explicit statements, though sometimes that too, but through the emotional atmosphere of their family. They learned that when they took care of a parent's emotional needs, they received warmth, attention, something that felt like love. And when they failed to do this, when they had their own needs, their own emotions, their own desires, that warmth disappeared. Sometimes it was replaced with rage. Sometimes with cold withdrawal, sometimes with guilt so thick the child could barely breathe through it. So the child made a calculation that no child should ever have to make. They decided, unconsciously, that their needs were the problem, that their desires were dangerous, that the safest strategy for survival was to become whatever the people around them needed, to sense the emotional currents in the room and shape themselves accordingly, to abandon their own internal experience and focus entirely on managing everyone else's. Jung called this the extinction of authentic selfhood. The child doesn't just learn to help others, they learn that having a self, having needs, boundaries, preferences, desires that conflict with what others want, is threatening. The self becomes the enemy, and the child develops an identity built entirely around service, sacrifice, and the suppression of anything that looks like personal need. This is what grows up to become the adult empath who can't say no, who feels physical pain at the thought of disappointing someone, who gives until they're empty and then gives more, who experiences their own needs as selfish, burdensome, evidence that something is wrong with them. They're not generous, they're terrified that if they stop giving, they'll lose whatever thin thread of love they've managed to secure, terrified that their authentic self, the one with needs and limits and desires, is fundamentally unlovable. Jung saw this pattern with devastating clarity. The empath's selflessness wasn't a spiritual achievement. It was a trauma response so deeply embedded that it had become personality. They weren't choosing to give, they were compelled to give because stopping felt like death, not dramatic, metaphorical death. The nervous system registered self-assertion as genuinely life-threatening because in childhood, it was. Expressing needs led to punishment. Having boundaries led to abandonment. Being a self led to the withdrawal of the only love available. So the body learned, selfhood is dangerous, service is survival. This is why telling an empath to just set boundaries doesn't work. You're not asking them to learn a new skill. You're asking them to override a survival mechanism that their entire nervous system believes is keeping them alive. Their body will fight them. Their anxiety will spike. Their guilt will become suffocating. Every cell will scream that they're making a terrible mistake. Because the body doesn't know the difference between childhood and now. It just knows, the last time you put yourself first, love disappeared. Jung understood that this couldn't be solved with boundary-setting techniques or self-care routines. Those approaches treat the symptom while ignoring the wound. What the empath actually needed was something far more radical and far more terrifying. They needed to reclaim the parts of themselves they'd been taught to destroy. They needed to resurrect the self that was extinguished in childhood. And that self, the one with needs, desires, limits, the capacity to say no, the willingness to prioritize its own survival, that self looked selfish to everyone who'd been benefiting from its absence. Here's where Jung's framework becomes crucial. He recognized that for the empath, selfishness wasn't just a behavior to learn. It was shadow material, the darkest, most rejected, most feared part of their psyche. Everything they'd been taught was wrong about themselves. Wanting things, needing things, putting themselves first, saying no, walking away, choosing their own well-being over someone else's comfort. All of that had been pushed into the shadow, locked away, condemned. Jung's concept of shadow integration meant that healing required retrieving exactly what had been rejected. And for the empath, what had been rejected was the self, their own needs, their own desires, their own right to exist as something other than a vessel for others' comfort. The shadow of the selfless person is selfishness, and Jung was adamant. You cannot become whole by continuing to reject your shadow. You become whole by integrating it. This is what made Jung's approach so radical and so uncomfortable for the empaths he worked with. He wasn't telling them to be a little less giving. He wasn't suggesting they practice self-care on Sundays. He was telling them that the part of themselves they'd been trained to hate, the part that wanted things for itself, that didn't want to sacrifice, that was tired of carrying everyone, that part wasn't their flaw, it was their salvation. And until they let it speak, until they gave it room, until they let it make decisions, they would continue hemorrhaging themselves into other people's lives until there was nothing left to bleed. Jung found that empaths resisted this integration more ferociously than almost any other shadow work he observed. Someone integrating their anger could at least conceptualize anger as sometimes necessary. Someone integrating their sexuality could acknowledge desire as natural. But asking an empath to integrate selfishness, to claim the right to put themselves first, their entire identity collapsed, because they'd built everything on the foundation of being the one who gives. Remove that foundation and what's left? Who are you if you're not the person who sacrifices? This identity crisis, Jung observed, was the actual doorway to healing. Not a pleasant doorway, not an inspiring one, a terrifying one. The empath had to face the possibility that without their compulsive giving, they didn't know who they were, that their generosity wasn't a personality trait, but a performance, that the love they received wasn't for them, but for what they provided. And sitting with that recognition, that you may have never been loved for who you are because you never let anyone see who you are, is one of the most devastating psychological experiences a person can have. But Jung would tell you it's also the most necessary, because the empath who never faces this continues to operate from the wound. They give and attract people who take and take. They sacrifice and call it love, while their body develops chronic illness, their mind develops anxiety and depression, Their spirit shrinks smaller and smaller until the person who once felt everything starts feeling nothing. Not because they've healed, because they've been so thoroughly emptied that there's no self left to feel anything. Jung documented this progression with uncomfortable precision. The empath starts out vibrant, sensitive, deeply connected to the world around them. Then, years of compulsive giving begin to hollow them out. Their health deteriorates, their joy disappears, their relationships feel like obligations. They start resenting the very people they can't stop helping. And that resentment, that dark, guilty, shameful resentment, is actually the shadow knocking on the door, the self they buried alive, fighting to get out. The resentment is not the problem. Jung was emphatic about this. The resentment is the message. It's the authentic self saying, I exist, I have needs, I am dying in here. And if you keep ignoring me, I will make you so miserable that you have no choice but to listen. Most empaths, when they feel resentment, try harder to suppress it. They double down on giving. They feel guilty for resenting and attempt to prove they're still the good, selfless person they've always been. They interpret the resentment as evidence that they're becoming a bad person, rather than recognizing it as evidence that a buried part of them is demanding to be acknowledged. And this suppression is what eventually leads to the collapse, the burnout, the breakdown, the moment where the empath physically cannot continue and the giving stops, not from choice, but from total system failure. Jung believed there was a better path, one where the empath didn't have to wait for collapse, one where they could choose to integrate their shadow before their shadow forced the issue through crisis. But this path required something the empath had never done, choosing themselves deliberately, not because they had nothing left to give, not because they'd collapsed, but because they recognized, with full awareness, that they had the right to exist for their own sake, that their needs mattered, that their desires were valid, that taking care of themselves wasn't a betrayal of love, but the very foundation love requires. And this is where people got confused. And what it looks like from the outside when an empath begins this integration, when they start reclaiming the self they buried, is ugly. It looks selfish. It looks cold. It looks like the empath has become someone else entirely. Because they have. They're becoming someone who was never allowed to exist. And that someone has a lot of suppressed needs that are going to surface all at once. The empath who starts saying no after decades of yes doesn't do it gracefully. They do it clumsily, sometimes harshly, sometimes with a fury that surprises everyone, including themselves. Because the shadow doesn't emerge polished and balanced, it emerges raw. The needs that were suppressed for 30 years don't surface as gentle requests. They surface as demands. The anger that was buried under layers of accommodation doesn't arrive as mild irritation. It arrives as rage. Jung expected this. He didn't see it as failure. He saw it as the necessary mess of reclaiming what was lost. You can't surgically remove a buried self with precision. It erupts. And the eruption is chaotic and imperfect and sometimes damaging, but it's real. For the first time in the empath's life, something real is happening instead of the endless performance of selflessness that was slowly killing them. The people around the empath don't understand this. They preferred the accommodating version, the one who anticipated their needs before they spoke them, the one who never made demands, the one who absorbed their emotions without complaint. That version was convenient, useful, comfortable, and now it's gone, replaced by someone who has opinions and boundaries and the audacity to prioritize their own well-being. And the people who benefited from the old arrangement will fight to get it back. Jung documented how this resistance from others became the empath's greatest test. Because the voices outside mirrored the voice inside. You're being selfish. You've changed. What happened to you? You used to be so caring. You used to be there for everyone. Now you're cold. Now you only think about yourself. And the empath, still fragile in their new selfhood, still unsure whether they're healing or destroying everything, hears these accusations and feels the pull to return, to go back to the bleeding, to resume the sacrifice. Because at least when they were giving themselves away, people called it love. This is the crossroads Jung identified as the most critical moment in an empath's psychological development. The moment when they have to decide whether they're going to let other people's comfort determine how they live, or whether they're going to tolerate being called selfish long enough to discover who they actually are underneath the compulsive giving. One direction leads back to the familiar suffering. The other leads into unknown territory, a version of themselves they've never met because they were never allowed to exist. And if you've been carrying others for so long that you've forgotten what your own life feels like without their weight, that recognition, that quiet understanding that something inside you needs to change, is exactly where real inner work begins. Our guide, True Self-Discovery, offers 24 reflection exercises rooted in Jung's teachings, designed for exactly this kind of turning point. The kind where you stop asking what everyone else needs and start asking who you actually are beneath the giving. You'll find the link below. But for now, let's keep going. Because understanding why this transformation is necessary is only half the picture. What matters next is what happens when an empath actually survives the crossroads. Jung found that empaths who made it through this crossroads, who tolerated the guilt, the accusations, the terror of losing love, the identity crisis of not knowing who they were without their sacrifice, underwent a transformation so complete that he compared it to psychological death and rebirth. The person who emerged on the other side was fundamentally different, not because they'd gained something new, because they'd stopped suppressing something essential. The first thing that changed was perception. The empath who had integrated their shadow could suddenly see their past relationships with devastating clarity. They could see how they'd been used, not always maliciously. Sometimes the people around them genuinely didn't realize what they were taking, but used nonetheless. The empath could see every instance where they'd abandoned themselves to maintain someone else's comfort, every time they'd swallowed their truth to keep the peace, every moment where they'd chosen someone else's well-being over their own and called it love when it was actually fear. This seeing was agonizing, because it meant acknowledging that much of what the empath had believed was love was actually a transaction. I give you everything, and in return, you don't abandon me. I sacrifice my needs, and in return, you let me stay. I perform selflessness, and in return, you call me good. Jung called this the grief of false love, the devastating recognition that love built on self-abandonment isn't love at all. It's a survival strategy wearing love's face. But alongside this grief came something the empath had never experienced, the beginning of genuine self-relationship. For the first time, they were occupying their own life, not monitoring everyone else's emotional state, not scanning the room for who needed what, not running the constant background calculation of how to keep everyone comfortable. They were just present, in their own body, with their own thoughts, experiencing their own feelings without immediately translating them into action for someone else. Jung described this as the return to the authentic self, and he noted that for empaths, this return felt alien. They didn't know how to exist without a project, without someone to fix or save or accommodate. Sitting with themselves, attending to their own needs, experiencing their own desires without guilt, this was unfamiliar territory. Some empaths described it as emptiness, others described it as silence. But Jung recognized it as the first real peace they'd ever known. The silence wasn't absence, it was the cessation of a noise so constant they'd stopped recognizing it, the endless calculation of everyone else's needs drowning out their own. The second transformation Jung documented was the complete restructuring of relationships. The integrated empath didn't just set better boundaries. They became fundamentally incompatible with the relationship dynamics that had previously defined their life. The people who'd been drawn to the old empath, the one who gave endlessly, who never demanded reciprocity, who made everyone else feel taken care of without requiring care in return, those people couldn't connect with the new version. Because the new version required something the old version never demanded: mutuality. This meant relationships ended, sometimes dramatically, sometimes through quiet dissolution. The empath would look at a friendship that had lasted 20 years and recognize, with the clarity that shadow integration brings, that it had always been one-directional, that they'd been giving for 2 decades while receiving nothing but the privilege of being needed, and they couldn't unsee this. The old empath could maintain the illusion that this was meaningful connection. The integrated empath couldn't. Jung didn't sugarcoat the cost of this clarity. He acknowledged that empaths going through this transformation often lost most of their relationships. Family members who relied on their accommodation, friends who depended on their endless availability, partners who'd built an entire relationship around never having to meet the empath's needs. All of these connections either transformed or ended, and the empath, already navigating the terrifying territory of a new identity, had to survive this loss simultaneously. But Jung also documented what replaced these lost relationships, and this is where his framework offers genuine hope. The integrated empath attracted fundamentally different people, not people drawn to what the empath could give them, people drawn to who the empath actually was. For the first time, the empath experienced relationships where their needs were considered, where reciprocity was natural, not something they had to beg for, where they could be honest about their limits without losing connection, where they could have a bad day without feeling like they were failing everyone around them. These relationships felt foreign to the empath at first. They'd been so conditioned to earn love through sacrifice that receiving love for simply existing felt wrong, suspicious, like something that couldn't last. Jung found that empaths in this phase often tried to sabotage new healthy relationships by reverting to old patterns, overgiving, over-accommodating, suppressing needs, because the familiar dysfunction felt safer than unfamiliar health. This is where Jung's concept of individuation became essential. Individuation isn't just about knowing yourself, it's about being able to tolerate being yourself in the presence of others. For the empath, this meant learning to sit in a relationship without losing themselves in it, to care about someone without abandoning their own needs, to love without self-annihilation. These sound like basic human capacities, but for someone whose entire life was built on erasure, they represent revolutionary change. The third transformation was perhaps the most paradoxical. Jung found that empaths who integrated their selfishness, who reclaimed their right to prioritize themselves, actually became more genuinely compassionate, not less. This confused everyone, including the empaths themselves. How could becoming more selfish make you more compassionate? Jung's explanation was precise. The old empaths' giving wasn't compassion, it was compulsion. They gave because they couldn't stop, because their identity required it, because not giving triggered survival-level terror. There was no choice in it, no freedom, no genuine generosity, just the mechanical outpouring of someone who didn't know how to exist any other way. The integrated empath could choose. They could see someone's pain and decide whether to engage. They could recognize a need and evaluate whether meeting it served both people or just perpetuated a harmful dynamic. They could offer help from fullness rather than emptiness, from genuine desire rather than desperate obligation. And this kind of giving, chosen, boundaried, sustainable, was infinitely more valuable than the compulsive bleeding that preceded it. Jung noted that the integrated empath's help actually worked. The old empath's compulsive giving often enabled dysfunction. They'd rescue people from consequences that would have taught them. They'd absorb emotions that others needed to learn to process. They'd solve problems that weren't theirs to solve, preventing the other person from developing their own capacity. Their selflessness, ironically, often harmed the people they were trying to help. The integrated empath could see this pattern clearly. They understood that sometimes the most compassionate thing was to let someone struggle, to witness pain without rushing to fix it, to hold space without absorbing, to care deeply while maintaining the separateness that allows both people to exist as whole individuals rather than enmeshed fragments. This is what Jung meant when he said empaths must become selfish to survive. He wasn't advocating narcissism or cruelty. He was describing the necessary reclamation of selfhood that had been stolen in childhood. The word selfish was deliberately provocative because Jung understood that empaths needed to be shaken out of their identification with selflessness. They needed to see that what they called virtue was actually a wound, that what they called love was actually fear, that what they called giving was actually a desperate strategy to avoid the abandonment that had defined their earliest experiences. Becoming selfish in Jung's framework meant becoming a self, having desires and honoring them, having limits and enforcing them, having needs and expressing them, having a life that existed for its own sake, and not solely as a support system for everyone else's existence. This wasn't selfishness as the world defines it, it was selfhood. But for someone who'd never been allowed to have a self, claiming one felt like the most selfish thing imaginable. Jung addressed something else that empaths rarely talk about, but almost universally experience during this transformation: pleasure. The empath who begins choosing themselves discovers, often with shock, that they're allowed to enjoy their life. Not as a reward for suffering, not as a break between episodes of serving others, but as a basic condition of being alive. They're allowed to do things solely because those things feel good. They're allowed to pursue interests that benefit no one but themselves. They're allowed to spend time, energy, and resources on their own happiness without justifying it as somehow ultimately serving others. This discovery, that pleasure doesn't require justification, is revolutionary for the empath. Their entire framework had positioned personal enjoyment as something earned through sufficient sacrifice. Rest was earned through exhaustion. Joy was earned through suffering. Relaxation was earned through productivity on behalf of others. But the integrated empath dismantles this economy. They recognize it for what it is: a system designed to ensure they never stop producing value for others. A hamster wheel dressed up as a moral code. Jung was clear that empaths who couldn't learn to receive pleasure without guilt were still operating from the wound. The capacity to enjoy your own life, to prioritize your own happiness, to spend an afternoon doing absolutely nothing for anyone but yourself. This wasn't indulgence. It was evidence that you'd finally stopped treating yourself as a resource to be depleted and started treating yourself as a person to be lived. But Jung also warned about a danger during this integration that catches many empaths off guard. When the shadow of selfishness first emerges, it can swing to an extreme. The empath who spent decades giving everything might temporarily become genuinely selfish, not healthily self-prioritizing, but reactively self-centered. This is the overcorrection phase, and Jung considered it normal and necessary. The pendulum has to swing past center before it finds balance. During this phase, the empath might become callous where they were once compassionate, might dismiss others' needs where they once anticipated them, might pursue their own desires with a ruthlessness that surprises everyone, including themselves. Jung didn't see this as regression. He saw it as the shadow expressing itself fully before integration could occur. You can't integrate something you won't let yourself experience completely. The empath has to taste full selfishness before they can find the balance between self-abandonment and self-absorption. The people around the empath during this overcorrection phase will be convinced the empath has lost their way, become a bad person, gone too far. And the empath needs to hear this without letting it pull them back to the old pattern. Because the old pattern is death. The overcorrection is messy, but it's temporary. The final destination, the integrated self that can give and receive, that can prioritize others and prioritize themselves, that can be generous without being depleted. That destination can only be reached by passing through the overcorrection. Jung's ultimate vision for the healed empath was someone who'd made peace with every part of themselves, the giver and the withholder, the compassionate one and the boundaried one, the self that wants to help and the self that knows when helping is harmful, not choosing one over the other, holding both, being both, deploying each as the situation demands, rather than being trapped in one mode because childhood made the other one feel like death. This integration creates what Jung called the sovereign empath, someone whose sensitivity is still profound but no longer compulsive, someone who feels deeply but isn't controlled by feeling, someone who can perceive others' pain without being obligated to fix it, someone who gives from choice rather than from terror, someone who can sit in a room full of suffering people and remain whole, not cold, not detached, whole, present without being consumed, caring without self-abandoning, there, but also, finally, here, in themselves, occupying their own life fully for the first time. If you've spent your life giving everything and feeling guilty for wanting anything in return, Jung would tell you that guilt is not evidence that you're doing something wrong. That guilt is the old programming firing, the childhood survival mechanism activating to keep you in your place. The familiar voice that says your needs don't matter, that you exist to serve, that wanting something for yourself makes you a bad person. That voice isn't wisdom, it's a wound, and you've been mistaking it for your conscience your entire life. Your needs are real, your desires are valid. Your right to prioritize your own survival isn't something you have to earn through sufficient sacrifice. It exists because you exist. And the people who can't love you unless you're bleeding for them don't love you. They love what you provide. There is a difference. And seeing that difference clearly, even though it devastates you, is the beginning of an entirely different kind of life. Jung spent decades watching empaths destroy themselves in the name of love, watching them sacrifice their health, their happiness, their sanity on the altar of selflessness. And he concluded that the most dangerous lie empaths believe is that their worth comes from what they give, because that lie ensures they never stop giving, never rest, never turn inward, never discover that beneath all the compulsive service, there's a person. A real, full, deserving person who's been waiting their entire life for someone to take care of them. And that someone was always supposed to be them. Becoming selfish isn't the empath's downfall. It's the empath's resurrection, the reclamation of a self that was sacrificed before it ever had the chance to exist. And yes, it looks selfish to the people who benefited from the sacrifice, but their comfort was never your responsibility. Your life is your responsibility. Your well-being is your responsibility. Your wholeness is your responsibility. And if meeting that responsibility means some people call you selfish, then let them. You've spent enough of your life dying for their approval. It's time to start living for your own. That's what Jung understood. That's what most people teaching empaths get wrong. They tell you to set boundaries while keeping the underlying structure intact. Jung would tell you to demolish the underlying structure entirely, to stop being the person who gives and start being a person, period. Not defined by your utility to others, not measured by your sacrifice, not valued for your accommodation, just alive, just present, just finally, mercifully, unapologetically yourself. And if that resonates, if something in you has been quietly starving while you fed everyone else, our guide, True Self-Discovery, was built for this exact moment. 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, designed not to add another obligation to your life, but to turn your attention inward for once, to help you find your way within, maybe for the first time. Click below to get True Self-Discovery.